I'm now going to hand over to Chris. Look, this is an efficient panel, all standing up ready to go. I wouldn't expect anything less from Chris Miller of Shearwater. I'm going to hand over to Chris. Chris is a boutique financier active around the world with his panel of Dominique, Oliver, and David.
Thanks, Al. Hey, good morning.
Free seating?
What's that?
Free seating?
Yeah. All right, so we'll start off here, and there's going to be a couple questions for the audience that we kind of asked if you guys could fill out, and then if you have any questions, obviously just type them in to Slido. So I'm going to start off introducing from left to right here is David Dixon, who's the president of Jetcraft Asia. And David, who's based in Hong Kong, has been with Jetcraft running Asia since 2012, and as some of you know, Jetcraft is one of the largest, if not the largest, kind of brokerage firm in the world. He's lived and worked in Asia for more than 30 years, and prior to Jetcraft, David was with Bombardier. We got 50 years with them?
33 years, 33 years, 11 months and 19 days.
Wow.
That's on my pension, so I know.
And he's also the former vice chairman of ASBA. And then to his left is Oliver Stone, based in London since 2011, and he moved there from the US to start his own brokerage firm after 8 years working with a firm in Texas, right?
Yes, sir.
And then to his left is Dominique Trinquet, who's the president of Boutsen Aviation. Dominique has been with Boutsen Aviation for nearly 20 years, and you initially started out your career as a pilot and flew over 10 years before you made the transition.
That is true, Chris.
Okay.
Less than David, but...
So, kind of start out with, I'll start out with you, Oliver. So, as a financier, we get involved in transactions, primarily looking over the shoulder of our borrower, who's buying an aircraft. And then also we get involved with seller, as an owner, as a seller for aircraft that we repossess. So, over my experiences, I've dealt with, professional brokers, and I've also dealt with some that are maybe shouldn't be brokers or pretending to be. And for your perspective of being in the US and Europe, can you talk about the number of brokers and the professionalism of them and any differences between the two places?
So the U.S. is a much larger market, just as many more airplanes are based there, and as a result there's a lot more brokers in the United States. And one of the things that most people don't know is that there is zero regulation at all of any brokers. So there is no barrier to entry, and a lot of people join the business because they either see fast and easy money or because it looks very glamorous. Neither of which is true, as anybody here can tell you. It's a very hard business and the money is pretty hard to earn, but a lot of people fall in love with it because the idea of what it may be. There are a lot of brokers out there. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, competition is good for everyone. It's good for clients and customers. But it's a very complicated game. And especially if you're moving airplanes around jurisdictions, it gets very tricky to do it properly. And having someone that knows what they're doing well is a real pleasure to work with. And when we're across the table from somebody who is very good at what they do and is a true professional, it makes our lives a lot easier. It makes the clients' lives a lot easier. It makes deals much easier to do. So there's fewer brokers in Europe than there are in the U.S. The market is much smaller. It's about 1/10 the size of the United States. So obviously there's fewer people competing for that business. But and the professionalism actually we found in Europe is significantly higher. There's a lot of people like the gentleman here to my left who really know what they're doing, and it's a true joy working with them. So
yeah. And David, what about Asia? Just a general on the professionalism of brokers over here in transactions, and how that differs maybe from other parts of the world.
I think crucially we're in a worldwide business, so the broking of an aeroplane doesn't have to be just within Asia. It's taking it from Asia back to Europe or back to the States, or bringing from the States into this part of the world. So obviously there's a lot of activity from the North American, European broker entities. But the local ones have sprung up, again, for the same reasons. It's a new business, it's exciting, it's got a lot of glamour to it, but at the end of the day, it still is a worldwide business, and I think that the local entities will find they've got to move internationally to make it really work properly. I think the level of, in some areas, of professionalism is lacking. Again, same reasons. The entry barriers are very minimal. You can start out with a laptop or from the flight deck. And those things, I think, are the bad side of it. But it's very hard to know how you regulate this. NARA now IATA, if I got that right.
It's IATA by a jet,
yeah.
is what they say.
Is an effort to try and provide some sort of baseline targets for minimum standards. I think that's good, and that's going to come here, and that'll clean out some of the lesser well-organized, if that's a better way of putting it, without being polite, brokerage in the area.
Yeah.
Chris,
Dominique. Yeah.
I may add simply, I mean, there is, going back to brokers, there is two types of brokers. The brokers are used to do transactions, which are national transactions. And our activity, mainly from Oliver, from David, is international transactions. And that makes the big difference. Because international transaction, you have to deal with more aspects of the transaction, from tax opinion, from technical appraisal, from conformity side, and everything. So speaking about brokers, there is internal US brokers who know how to deal internally, and the rest of the world do only international transactions. And this is our main activity from this side. Part of Europe, you know, when we did make this in Europe, it is automatically international transaction because we sell internally in Europe, we sell overseas, we sell in Asia. So that requires a kind of long training and education on top of it.
So for back-to-back transactions, now, talking from a general level, we're all familiar with them, we've seen them, and we all have our own opinions about them. But I'd be interested in the panel's perspective, and Dominique, we can start out with you. Your thoughts on back-to-back transactions, and did you believe that they're becoming more or less common?
It's a tricky situation, speaking purely about back-to-back transaction. The main question should be, why should we have a back-to-back transaction? And the key point is, first of all, you may have a person in between who wants to make a lot of money out of the deal. And the second point is that sometimes you have to cover some third parties in terms of commission when the buyer or seller doesn't want to pay anything from the transaction itself. So that's why you have back-to-back transactions that do exist. It's just a question of ethic on top of it. Will you do it or won't we do it, simply? Most of the time, it's not only the response from the broker, the response comes from the different parties involved with the transaction, meaning the buyer and the seller. Everything has to be transparent. That's the most important. And then you have lawyers also who are not very pleased to go through this kind of process because you don't know where the funds come from exactly. You have to make sure you know who is handling the tender of the funds, and it will be dedicated to the transaction at the end, you know, definitely. So it's a big risk on top of it. And today's date, we don't see much back-to-back transaction, less and less than in the past, you know, because of the transparency that we have to bring to the transaction itself.
Exactly. Oliver?
Right. And to add to that as well, is the more complicated a transaction gets with regards to international deals, the much higher the risk becomes for people doing back-to-back deals. And so we find a lot of people don't want to take that risk on. You get a lot of issues like who was going to actually officially deregister the airplane and how that process is going to work. And when you have middlemen in between that can
So the more complicated the transaction, the more difficult it is to have those extra middlemen on back-to-back.
That's correct, yeah. That's correct. And so, inherently there's nothing illegal about someone buying an asset at X and selling it for X plus 10%. That's just a form of arbitrage if you think about it. But I think where most people have issues with, and particularly on the legal standpoint, is, as Dominique said, is the ethics of it all. Is usually it's there to hide money that neither buyer nor seller would pay, or for someone to receive cash they shouldn't be receiving that neither buyer or seller would pay it. And that's where it becomes problematic. So.
Yeah, from a financier's perspective, when we have borrowers, and I've seen this a handful of times, and it puts us in a very awkward position where we see our borrower buying an airplane that we're financing, and a lot of times, just because we're close to the market, we're seeing the middlemen, and we're seeing the back-to-back because we're tracing the title, and it just puts us in a very awkward position. And David, I'm assuming for brokers, when you're representing a buyer, I guess you can just make sure that that's not even it's not happening, or if it is, it's completely transparent to your buyer.
It's got to be transparent, but I think, without overplaying this point, it's one of many different structures. I mean, we have another way of doing this. We end up buying an airplane. We, Jetcraft, will take a position in airplanes. We've got a credit line, about $350 million US, and we will have at any one point probably $300 million worth of assets on our books. So we buy it. The trick is, if we can flip it straight away, we make more money. If we sit on it for a year or 6 months, that'll clean us out very quickly.
Yeah, so that's different than a back-to-back, because a lot of times you're not holding for very long, but because you have the capital to buy it. It's just you have it sold before, maybe before the transaction comes through.
Well, that's where, going back to the earlier point about the worldwide coverage, if you find an aeroplane coming out of Macau and I can find a way of putting it into Mexico, that's my strength. And that's my aim, to try and roll the thing over very quickly. Maybe roll over is not the right word, but move the thing on as quick as possible. But
every time I sell an airplane, you guys are lowballing to try to buy it really low, so you can.
There are distressed airplanes. There are airplanes out there, of course.
Joke.
Who hasn't tried to buy low? I mean, in all my life of selling every aeroplane I've sold, no one's ever tried to pay over the odds. How about that?
That's a good point.
That's buying for inventory. It's a bit different than the back-to-back contract.
So I think we all kind of agree that it always seems to take longer to close a deal, longer than expected. And Dominique, I'll go back to you. What would you say is the most likely things to delay a deal, and how do you typically address
It's
them?
easy. It's lawyers and bankers. So
Which ones are worse? Which is worse? No, seriously.
no. Seriously, I would say the key point, once you reach to the contract side and you have a duly executed contract, you can move really forward with the transaction. And the next step being, of course, the pre-buy inspection. And this is, even on recent product, or I would say older aircraft, you may face to some technical issues. Main point being sometimes corrosion, which requires engineering mods afterward to get it treated. You can get a lot of issue arising during the pre-buy inspection, and this is what may delay the transaction, and we have no way of controlling it. It's just a pure finding, and we have to make the aircraft in the delivery conditions. Without fixing it, we can't deliver. So this is what will delay the transaction up to the end. Afterward, the rest is basic, from deregistration, title change. It's a normal process, easy. But purely from technical matters, that's what can arise on a long process of transaction.
And Oliver, look at your thoughts on that too, and if you can also just address one of the points that Dominique brought up, as far as the pre-purchase inspections and slots, if that's becoming more or less of an issue, or for different types?
We see it becoming a much bigger issue now. And OEMs, I know this came up yesterday, and I have a slightly different opinion from the folks at Jet Aviation, where we're finding that as OEMs are pulling maintenance back in-house because they want to make more money out of it, they find it's, the airplane sales business is kind of turning to the razor model, where you get the razor for free, but you pay for the razor blades. Well, it's kind of along those lines now, where it's maintenance is becoming a big profit center for OEMs. As a result, I'm going to use a specific example. Textron, for example, has removed a lot of the authorized service facilities for Textron Aviation products in Europe, because they want all airplanes to come back in-house to a Textron-owned facility. Well, as a pre-buy, you have a buyer and seller, each has their own facility they want to go to, right? But no one wants to go to the local friendly facility of the opposite party. So the OEM becomes actually really the only neutral arbiter you can go to on that front. Because they've removed all these other facilities, we now have a big slot crunch issue. And it's when a deal first gets agreed, it's one of the first things we try to find is, when can we get in? And we'll go to 6 or 7 different facilities around Europe and ask, when's your next slot? And the answer might be tomorrow if you're lucky, and it might be 6 weeks from now. And so this is a bigger issue from timing. And most clients either haven't been through the process before, aren't too aware of it, and they don't understand why it takes 6 weeks from the moment they say, I agree to buy it, to then start doing an inspection.
Is that going to get worse or better over the next year or two?
I personally think it's going to get worse. I think more and more OEMs are going to pull as much maintenance as they can do in-house. And people like to go, again, to OEM-owned facilities for maintenance, for pre-purchase inspections, just because there is a badge of approval on there from the person who built the plane. So I see it becoming a bigger issue as time carries on.
And David, for aircraft that are based over here in Asia, is that an issue, finding slots for pre-purchase inspections?
Excuse me, my experience doesn't point to big problems. I mean, a week delay or something like that, nothing significant, not several weeks, no. I think sometimes the bigger issue is the seller, because a lot of my clients are first-time sellers. They haven't been through the process and they're a little bit nervous, or they're over-optimistic. Well, I've agreed to sell it, why hasn't it gone? And if anyone's tried to buy an apartment in Hong Kong will know what I mean. You put down your money, not unlike buying in somewhere like Europe, where you then have a lawyer check out all the titles. They expect you to put the money down straight away, and you've lost it if you don't complete it. There's a little bit of that in the aircraft business, but that's through a lack of familiarity. But the whole process is a learning process here, generally, and that, I think, can be the biggest delaying factor. Slots may increasingly so. Yesterday I made the point about the number of transactions growing. It could be a pressure point, but that's probably why you see quite a few more OEMs, and they're all coming under sort of international branded names now, and so you might be able to mix and match and move around a bit more than we have in the past.
If I could add one thing to the delays, Chris, the purchase agreement process, there's a lot of things you have to work through from a logistics standpoint before you can actually sign a purchase agreement. And that part actually takes a lot more time. It's figuring out where the tax implications may be for closing an airplane deal in a certain area, which you then have to go out and find third-party, knowledgeable providers who can give that or advice to you. It's understanding, how the structures are going to affect the operational perspective. It's understanding how things of deregistration will work. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, you can only deregister an aircraft if you have original signed documents present at the Civil Aviation Administration and handed to them. Well, if you have an airplane in Guernsey that's closing because at the tax-neutral location, you have to work out in advance of signing that purchase agreement how all that process works out where both sides are in agreement with it. And that just takes a lot of time. There's many moving parts in these deals, especially that involve export-import into and out of another country. And resolving how all those steps work out in the purchase agreement always takes a lot more time than people realize.
In fact, Chris, this is the essence of our activity, of our job, just to be able to handle all these different processes of the transaction. Oliver was speaking about the contract, tax issues, the registration process, just to be upfront all the time before the closing, just to make sure that at the time of closing, everything will happen at the same time during the conf call we used to do with all the parties involved with the transaction. And that's what makes the job of the broker, knowing all the steps of the transaction and knowing how to handle them.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a big perception that a broker's job is you put A and B together and you disappear into the sunset, and that's very far.
Well, there's some brokers that's what they think their job is.
That is true. And
so when you run into that on the other side, how do you handle that?
Do
you do their job for them?
In effect, it's the best way to get our clients' objective done, which is to sell or buy their plane. And so if we come across someone on the other side who doesn't know what they're doing, we usually end up doing their job because fundamentally it's in our client's interest to do that. We don't want to end up in a situation where we have an airplane that's flagless for a long period of time or something else along those lines that will affect our client's objectives and position. So yeah, we do. I mean, we spend a lot of time doing that. But to Dominique's point, in the brokerage business, only a small part of our job is actually finding a buyer or a seller for a plane. The hardest part, the most time-consuming part, really is what do you do once you've got that? And that's something that most people don't recognize, and that it's putting all that stuff together to make sure you actually do the job you were hired to do. It takes a lot of time. So.
Just to sum up, Oliver, feedback. Our job, my point of view, starts at the time we have a customer, we have a deal. to be, it's not arrogancy, but when you have the right asset, the right price, with a proactive market, to find a buyer is not the most difficult thing. The most difficult point is to bring the transaction to success. And this is where our value plus is here, just to make the deal happening. And it takes huge energy, as you say, Oliver. Yeah.
How often, and David, I'll start off with this question, just out of curiosity, how often do you run into a buyer that doesn't have a broker helping them? And is that increased or decreased over the last several years?
If someone's got a mandate to go out and buy, that occurs a little bit, but not much. It doesn't. I haven't run into it very often.
Okay.
No, it's very much we're reaching out. I'm reaching out to who we see as the main target client. Sometimes people present themselves as being able to help you along the way, but you have to make a judgment call. But it's every deal is different. I think one of the things I find interesting about the role of trying to sell aeroplanes is no two deals are the same. They're all different, and that's the exciting bit. That's the adrenaline rush that I get out of waking up in the morning and doing this, because no two transactions are ever the same.
That's true. And Oliver, as far as you are on the acquisition side as well as the selling side. Which side would you say is easier, buying or selling?
There's no we're always seem to be, and you always seem to be on the wrong side of the equation on this one. Whenever the market's down and you run out and you go and try and buy an airplane for a client, you can never seem to find the right airplane that works. And again, this is something that you have to look into, of regulation and stuff that our clients, it takes a lot of time for them to understand this if they're not in the aviation business. For example, if we want to import an airplane into Europe, you have to have a series of avionics that are required, and in particular something called a flight data recorder. And you have to make sure any modifications have been approved by Europe. Well, by the time you look at a number of airplanes out there, there might be, say, 30 aircraft on the market, and you whittle it down, there might be 4 that you can actually buy. And of those 4, 3 might be overpriced and 1's ugly. And so then what do you do? And so that's something that there is no easy deal. Let me put it that way. I guess is where I'm going with this. There's usually an obstacle somewhere in there you weren't quite expecting. And I haven't seen an easy deal in many, many, many years, unfortunately. So.
And I run into just the acquisition sometimes with our borrowers where I see they're trying to, especially in this part of the world, and this was a couple years ago, a client from Indonesia, they were trying to buy an airplane and they're not using a broker, they're just trying to negotiate. And I sat down the principal's son, who was about 30 years old, and they were trying to buy this was years ago, a brand new Gulfstream. And I'm like, you guys should really think about hiring a broker. And he goes, but we're talking directly to the Gulfstream sales rep. And, and they were, in this part of the world, they pay a little bit higher price, and they were paying pretty healthy price. And it's like, they just weren't getting it, but.
And to your point about people buying it on their own, we do come across that quite frequently. And there's a lot of opportunities in there for people who are not in the aviation business. For example, they're in the mining or oil business. And aviation is a business of details. And there's 200 things you have to get right, and any one of which you don't, it can really pose a big issue for it. And so, in the end, you just have to treat people fairly for what they're doing. But we do see it quite frequently, and we end up kind of giving them advice, because the one thing we don't want them to do is feel like they were jilted and then come back and sue our clients, because it's not the right way. What we want in the end is a deal to be over and everyone disappear and enjoy the money or the airplane. So.
And Chris, I would say 95% of our transactions are dealing with brokers. If you go to the U.S. market, maybe 95% of the U.S. people are represented by a broker exclusively most of the time. I would say same in Europe, but the rest of the world, meaning Russia and certainly Asia, and I'm sure that David can explain a bit more about Asian people and how they used to deal with. But from this perspective, they don't understand sometimes the need or the requirement of the broker to be involved in the transaction. So this is for us a lot of education to bring to them. And when we don't have, I like to have a broker in front of me, because for me the job is much easier. We speak the same language at the end, and the language that we speak is having a closing, all done, and that's finished, you know, and no one will come back afterward, which Oliver said. So this is the key point when you don't have a broker in front of you. It requires you much more work than it should be on a normal transaction.
Yeah. David, you have any thoughts on that?
I come back to my point about every deal is different, and
Yeah.
maybe it's more that way in Asia because the buyers and sellers, I mean, they're first-time buyers, they're first-time sellers, much more than you're perhaps more familiar with in North America and Europe. So I just find myself, I can't say there's a pattern yet. I can't say, you know, when there's only, I say only, there's a small number of aeroplanes. I mean, the number of levels of transactions here in this part of the world, it's still fairly small. So there's no real pattern. You've put in China in there, and someone earlier yesterday's session was talking about nervousness about the legal structure in China. It's being tested pretty heavily on the streets of Hong Kong at the moment. There's a lot of nervousness. I don't think it's necessary, but sometimes when we're going through a transaction, we're wet nursing a lot of people who have got a lot of experience in this business, but when it comes to China, their shutters come down, or the nervous factor raises, or their concerns come up. So I think that's what I get excited about, is trying to navigate through that. And sometimes the involvement of too many layers in a transaction can complicate that type of transaction. Mm-hmm. Indonesia, Philippines, Australia, straightforward, pretty regular stuff, but the numbers are small.
Yeah. And Oliver, talking about, you know, prices and pricing in increases, and, you know, looking back over the last 12 or 18 months, have you noticed any kind of increase in transaction volumes, or witness any sort of price increases in the market, and what do you predict kind of going forward?
Yeah, this has actually been a bright spot. The previous 10 years, I'm sure that all three of us have spent most of our days giving people bad news about how much their airplanes lost value. And in certain circumstances, and in certain models, I should say, in the last 12 to 18 months, we have actually seen increases in value. And that has been news I haven't given in a long time. It's quite nice to see again. So, and the biggest ones that we've seen in terms of percentage-wise have been, you know, the Citation XLS, where that has significantly increased in value, and things like the Challenger 605 and Challenger 300s, you know, and those have really gone up quite a bit. Transaction volume is up as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of bright spots, at least there has been in the last 12 to 18 months. Now, it doesn't mean going forward that trend continues, but it's been a nice change that we've seen here.
It's completely true, Oliver. For the last 10 years, our job also was to explain our customers the depreciation of their asset and the aircraft. So it wasn't an easy task most of the time, just to tell them they lost $500,000 or $1 million simply in a few months. For the last year, maybe 2 years, we saw the inventories on specific segments lowering down. For instance, if you take simply the 7X market, the Gulfstream 550, they came to, we have kind of equation which means that when you have 5% of the existing fleet, below 5% of the existing fleet for sale on the market, it becomes a seller's market. And it is typical right. I mean, today's day, the 7X market, it's 4.5%, 550 is quite similar. And automatically, the price is rising up. And we can see from the 7X market within a year, they gained about $2 million, which was huge compared to the loss they experienced before. So definitely there is some, not all of them. We take the Global 5000, still decreasing. It's not really specific to a segment, but it is specific to a certain type of aircraft.
Mm-hmm. And Oliver, there's a question from the audience here. What's the most important thing your customers require when buying an aircraft? Connectivity, nice interior, low hours. And have you seen a change in that mentality? Or Dave, you want to take it?
There's one word: price. It's all value. I mean, yes, interior, the connectivity, that sort of thing. But I don't know anyone that's bought an airplane because it's got go faster internet system on it or something. You know, it's just.
It's a matter of taking it into account for what you
out
pay.
here. It's predominantly price. Style of interiors, you can solve that one.
Mm-hmm. But it's also, you can solve it with money, but it's also a time thing as well.
Yeah.
If it's, you know, it costs X, but if it takes 3 months, can be a long time.
when I'm getting airplanes that are coming out of the region, then there's other factors. There's the Asian element, which I alluded to yesterday, which people worry about in North America and Europe. That would be a factor. If it's been painted recently, and hopefully it's been painted in a fairly sedate manner and appearance and nothing too extravagant. Similarly with the interior, if it's been refurbished. It's the whole thing, but out here, it's price.
You know, I would say people buy airplanes when they fall in love, right? And they either fall in love with the airplane because it's gorgeous, it's low hours, it's whatever it is, it has the great internet, or they fall in love with the price. And it's one of the two. And if you're selling an airplane and you don't have any real reason for someone to fall in love with it, then it's going to be price. And, you know, these, I hate to say they're commoditized, but there's a pretty well-educated buyer group out there who understands what the value of airplanes is pretty carefully. And so having those attributes to help people fall in love with it really is beneficial. But if not, it really comes down to numbers and being fair price for what the asset is.
I think all of us experienced some transaction where the buyer never saw the aircraft, make the deal, simply. You know, that's why the color, the design is not the key point. We don't have too much human factor by chance to deal with. It's mainly technical issue, price issue, as David said, and then it's technical process. But we have some customers who never saw the aircraft before they pay for it.
And to give another answer here, it's not quite as specific as what they're asking, but in terms of what's the most important thing our customers require, it's actually education of how they're going to actually use the plane. And this is particularly true for first-time buyers. They come to us with a dream of, I've sold my company and I've always wanted to own a jet, let's go buy it. And one of the first things we have to tell them is, buying it is really, really easy, right? You're not buying it for the sake of buying it, you're buying it to use it and operate it. So now you have to put some thought behind that. And how does that work with crew? And how does that work on operating it? And how are you going to maintain it and insure it? And how are you going to get your guys trained? And all this stuff, that actually takes a much longer period of time, especially with first-time people, of going through that process. Because what we find is they go online late at night and they see something that's really pretty and they call up and they say, I really want to buy this plane because I love it. And you say, hang on a second here. You can't get crew for that airplane, or that airplane's never going to get certified in your jurisdiction, and you got to kind of step them back a lot to put into their heads that they're buying it to use it, not buying it to buy it.
Yeah. David?
There's one other point that comes to mind is the condition of an airplane. It doesn't matter whether it's from a styling point of view, not one's individual taste, but it's the condition of the airplane. I mean, that is a function that's pretty crucial, especially coming out of here. And you look at an airplane that's been living outdoors for 10 years, not been properly cleaned, it's going to be just sad. That'll all boil down to being, well, what's the value proposition, what's the price in all of this thing? And I get very concerned sometimes that people overlook that point at the beginning when they buy the aeroplane, that you want to stand planning for the sale of the aeroplane. There's no point making it so unique and abusing it and then expect to get the highest dollar at the end of a 10-year operation, because it isn't going to get it. It doesn't matter. The buyer is going to look at it and see it's not being properly looked after. The records are not in good shape. So one of the things I didn't realize so much when I was selling new airplanes, plan to sell it when you buy it.
For 33 years in 10 months?
I'm a slow learner. But it's once you're buying this thing, plan to sell it. Put it in a position at the beginning so that when you need to get out of it, for whatever reason you want to upgrade, you're going to ease that process.
So when you're educating, say, a first-time buyer here in Asia, walk through, I mean, you kind of just talked about it, but walk through the most important things that you need to educate them about buying it. And you just mentioned they need to have in mind when they're going to sell it, when they're buying it.
If it's a first-time buyer, someone who says, I want a Challenger 605 or I want a G450, and one thing I have found, one note in this business throughout life, is people want something bigger, better, more capable in some ways going forward. So at some point down the road, you're going to sell it. And so I'm now telling people, look, you might think a one-stop to London from Singapore is what you want, or non-stop to here, or carrying this number of people. Tomorrow you might see the world differently. So don't go and tie yourself down in such a way with this machine and making it sort of too much too much your airplane if you think you may want to upgrade, because it's going to cost you a lot of money in the transaction somewhere, whether it's redoing the interior. Don't have a completely off the wall interior, because the next person may not like it. It might be great for you, but what you're doing is you're adding $500,000 to the transaction somewhere. Someone's going to pay that to re-engineer the seats at the back or something, just to bring it back to what might be called normal. So when you're going into these things, the things I said is start thinking you will want something bigger, better, and faster down the road. How do I get out of that thing easily?
Yeah. Dominique, we're talking about available finance, and I know a lot of times brokers don't get involved in that or don't get asked, but in general, would you say the amount of aircraft financing available is increasing or decreasing, and especially, in emerging or developing markets?
Because of the market activity rising up, automatically you see banks coming on top of it again, A few years ago, bankers from aircraft financing was a bit far away, they had disappeared for some time. And maybe for the last 2 years, with the activities going back again, we saw a lot of groups like Swiss banks like Credit Suisse, UBS, with their aircraft financing department being much more active and trying to support our clients and provide some solutions, which before they were very reluctant to move forward. So now, for sure, we can see some more activity in the banking, financing, aircraft financing support.
Oliver, you have any thoughts on available finance?
We've seen a lot of it now, especially on the smaller side, where that's traditionally always one of the last places to pick up again is financing for airplanes that are less than $5 million. But in the last 2 years, we've seen a number of entrants coming back into that marketplace, expanding their offering to that marketplace, because they realize there's a lot of airplanes out there right now that are $5 million and less, and for whom that buyer is still an extraordinarily wealthy person, and it opens the door to them to do much other business with that individual. And great examples for it is we've had a couple clients buy $5 million Challengers. They're billionaires, but they just didn't want to spend more than $5 million on an airplane. That was their mentality, and we were able to help them with that just because of who they were and that there was actually a lot of options available for them in financing. So that's been a bright spot for us. We've seen a lot more.
What about age of the aircraft? Is there a kind of a line, you think, where the options start falling off?
We're kind of seeing that line get pushed out. It used to be it had to be less than 10 years old when the finance was done, and now it seems to have migrated to about 20 years old when the finance is over. So that's gotten a little bit softer as time's carried on. More than 20, I think then it's going to get a lot tougher to deal with. So.
In Asia, David, the availability of financing, how often do you get involved in that, or are you finding it more or less options recently?
The sort of individuals that are buying the airplanes, generally speaking, are being advised by a number of banks. They may have relationships with some of the obvious names who have already got aviation offices or units within their organization. When I say get involved, I haven't had someone come to me and say, if I can finance it, I can buy it. They've come to me knowing how they're going to pretty well do it. More so at the sort of longer range, bigger airplanes. There may be a bit of a competition between they've got a relationship with one of the European banks, and they then want to find out what others might be able to offer to keep the European banks honest. And I like to see a bit of competition between the banks sometimes, because you see them trying to win a high net worth individual's overall portfolio as part of the aircraft. That goes on. I quite enjoy that one. But it keeps, just adds another element, another bit of spice to the transaction.
Yeah. All right, so we're about to run out of time here, so I'm just going to have one last question that just if you can all just kind of give a quick answer to. So with being a broker, an aircraft broker, whether buying or selling, what would you say is the most critical skill to being successful to someone that was potentially thinking of becoming a broker? And I'll start with you, Dominique.
Being always on top of the transaction. I mean, that's following the transaction up to the end. You can't leave any open doors. If you leave something open, then you may face too bad issue.
Detail-oriented.
Exactly, full time.
Oliver?
Tenacity. And that involves both during the transaction where it gets very complicated and messy, and separately for someone who's trying to get into the business, it's a really tough game. And it's very well, it's not glamorous. 99% of what we do is the exact opposite of that. And sticking with that to do it takes a lot of determination.
David?
Tenacity.
He said that. You got to pick something else. I'm kidding.
Don't be surprised. You will not. I mean, last night I thought we were closing an aeroplane, and it's going to take another week for the most stupid reason. But you wake up at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, you think A, B, and C is going to happen. Come by Friday, it's X, Y, and Z. I think there is no set pattern.
Yeah.
That's one of the nice bits about it.
Hey, Al, do we have one more minute? I want to ask one more question. All right. That wasn't the last question. This is the last question. So this is going to be, if you can, I'd keep it to a yes or no answer. Over the next 10 years, do you believe that there will be any kind of regulation in the aircraft brokerage business?
There will be or should be?
How about will and should? Yeah, I know.
We tried to get some regulation, but never succeed up to now. We're not as educated in the yacht industry. Yacht industry, they have this kind of standard agreement called MIBA, and it works perfectly. And the on-the commission agreement also, they're very much more
than one word.
Is that French for no?
Yes, pretty sure. All right, Oliver.
Will there? No. Should there? Yes.
No.
No will and should?
No.
All right. All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. That was very interesting, and I appreciate it. Thank you.